Bibliophiles of the internet, my name's Adriana, and this marks the beginning of my reading vlog for Cemetery Boys by Aiden Thomas. If you live under a rock, this is my most anticipated release of 2020 by far, and when I got this proof copy in the mail, I just held it close and I said out loud, "My boys have come home." And that's really how it feels. Cemetery Boys is YA fantasy that is own voices for the queer and trans Latinx rep. It's about a trans boy named Yadriel whose entire family are brujex, and because they're deeply traditional, they will not allow him to perform the brujo rites of passage. So he decides to do the ritual himself, which will allow him to guide spirits into the afterlife. But his first time around, when he tries to summon the spirit of his recently deceased primo, he accidentally summons the wrong spirit. Instead of his cousin, he ends up with the resident school bad boy Julian Diaz, who is not going to go quietly into the afterlife and who fully intends to drag Yadriel into his unfinished business. This is actually my third day with this book. I'm over 100 pages in, and it's making me emo and soft as heck. I'm gonna start with the characters because I love them. I am captain of their protection squad, and the dumb boy energy is honestly off the charts and the best. Let me put it this way, Yadriel's first proper piece of dialogue is making a butt joke, and that's the moment I realized we're pretty much the same person and meant to be best friends. But on a serious note, I see so much of myself in him, and I understand his experiences as a queer trans masked Latinx person so much. He actually talks about wearing a binder, which I've never seen in a YA book, and how his hair was one of the first things that made him feel like himself, how those things help him feel in control of his presentation and appearance. There was this line where he said if nothing else, at least he could get a sick fade and use Suavecito pomade to get his hair under control, and guess what, fam? I deadass have a Yadriel starter pack. Binder, Suavecito, queer boys, I'm set. I'm convinced we're the same person, and I feel so exposed. But seriously, Yadriel actually acknowledges that to navigate language as a trans Latinx person is just an absolute landmine, especially when you're dealing with a language that is so deeply and sometimes arbitrarily gendered, such as Spanish. So obviously Yadriel is very important to me, and 10 out of 10, I would give my life for his. Julian is a gift. He's very much the lovable dumbass who always has some smartass remark up his sleeve. Aiden made this perfect character board for him that had Lance and Sokka and Aladdin and Bokuto, and that is his energy 100%. Major disaster boy energy, the kind of spirit who forgets that he's dead and falls down trying to kick something. He's restless and energetic and stupid, but you can tell he's definitely a soft boy beneath the surface. The story itself I love so far because it's equal parts self-discovery, mystery, and romance. There's elements of mystery woven in because Yadriel and his family are trying to figure out how his cousin Miguel died suddenly, and also they don't know how Julian died either and whether there's a connection between the two or not. Obviously there's a budding romance between Yadriel and Julian. It's just beginning to simmer at the moment, but that romantic tension and the way they cut off each other's sentences to make dumb dad jokes is just delicious. And then, of course, this entire journey has been about Yadriel wanting to prove something to his family, but really to himself. It's about how this entire process of learning to become a brujo is full of self-doubt. He feels really disconnected from his community because his family wasn't there to share in his ritual, and now that he's trying to do something as basic as summoning a spirit, nothing seems to be going according to script. And those speed bumps make him wonder if it's a cosmic sign that he's not worthy of Lady Death's blessings because he's trans and he's different. So he's definitely doubting himself and putting a lot of pressure on himself to do this the quote-unquote right way, and I think it's going to be really interesting to see him work through those insecurities. So long story short, I am loving every second I spend with these dumb boys, and I will tell you more of my thoughts in my next update. It is currently Wednesday. I am officially past the halfway point, and I can confirm that I am, in fact, living my best life because of this book. I have to start today by backtracking because yesterday I totally forgot to talk about our powerhouse supporting character Maritza, who is pretty badass. She is Yadriel's #1 cheerleader. She's always holding it down for him, getting ahead of any kind of misgendering, and always coming to his defense when it matters the most. She is ride or die for real, but she also represents how being a bruja is not a monolithic experience. Something really interesting about her is that even though technically she is a bruja, because she's also a vegan, she doesn't actually practice. She's also super vocal and adamant about rejecting feminine gender roles and being completely herself, which I really respect. So Maritza's awesome, and she's definitely part of the protection squad as much as anyone else. I have to return again to the trans Latinx rep because it is infusing me with so much life and purpose. This book is the perfect example of how to acknowledge someone's dead name without actually using it, because no one is actually entitled to that information unless a trans person wants them to know. And you see that in something as small as Yadriel not wanting to look himself up in his own yearbook because without a legal name change, the school refuses to take his dead name out of print. And I just relate so much to this phenomenon of being out to your family and being accepted to an extent. This to me is a very Latinx family dynamic where it's like we had the conversation, we try our best to be loving, but people might refer to you with the wrong name or pronouns, and we won't actually understand the kind of impact that has. There was this moment early on where Yadriel's abuelita basically says, yes, you are Yadriel, but I will always see you as my little girl. So even though there's acceptance to a certain level, there's still a disconnect. So people will call Yadriel by his name, but they won't really understand or respect or acknowledge who he truly is. And that, my friends, is nuance. And this story also acknowledges how when you wear a binder, people always do that little quick check and look down at your chest as if to say, are you what I think you are? Which isn't, super degrading or anything. The way gender dysphoria is depicted and experienced in this story is so spot on because Yadriel knows exactly who he is and he's doing all he can to stay confident. But when people hear his name for the first time or hear the pronouns other people are using for him in conversation, they're taken aback. And I can tell you, no matter how many times that happens or how much you think you're prepared for that to happen, it's still a slap in the face. So I think it's really valuable to see that disruption in the flow of the story when people have to stop and ask Yadriel, wait, for real? Or when they do that thing where they double check his chest, because that's a very real experience. And I definitely think that's why Yadriel has really internalized the metaphorical weight of his quinces as a brujo, because it's come to represent him proving himself as valid, and it's deeply tied up in this painful search for acceptance. It's also cool to see Julian pushing back on that and interrogating whether Yadriel is proving a point to his community and his family, or actually trying to prove something to himself, and responding to this ingrained fear that other people get to decide who he really is. So again, it's super good so far, and everything I could have ever wanted. It has made my stone cold heart very, very soft, and I look forward to sharing more of it in my next update. So it's currently Thursday. I have roughly 100 pages left to read, and if you guessed that I'm still thriving and living, then you would be 100% correct. I know I keep talking about this every day, but I love that Yadriel wears a binder and that it's casually mentioned to some degree fairly often. If it's hot outside and he's sweating through his binder, then you know. If it's raining and his binder's soaked through and sticking to his skin, you know. And I love that those logistics are included in the text. And even though the story explores gender dysphoria, misgendering, lack of acceptance, and other very real issues that trans people face, there's still something to hope for because Yadriel has people in his corner fighting fiercely on his behalf who just want him to have what everyone else has. There's his Tía Catriz, Maritza, and now Julian. They're all very forthright and steadfast in their beliefs, and they all accept Yadriel for exactly who he is. And I especially love Maritza for being the #1 hype man and encouraging Yadriel to go get that ghost ass. Julian especially is brash and unapologetic, holds nothing back, and he really wants to help Yadriel realize that he's not alone, that he's not the first trans brujo, and he certainly won't won't be the last, and there is comfort in knowing that. The dynamic between Julian and Yadriel is wildly soft and domestic, and I think because of their predicament, they both realize there's no use in putting up any kind of pretense. They have a very reciprocal relationship where if one of them does something for the other person wants to give something equivalent back, which is just precious. In both a literal and metaphorical way, they can truly see the other person in ways that no one else can, and the kind of intimacy that creates really comes through on every page. On a very different note, I also appreciate that this story talks about the lack of visibility and advocacy when it comes to lower class communities of color, especially how youth of color go unaccounted for within the system in so many ways. Julian has had that experience, and in school he was just written off as a bad kid. In death he's been written off as a runaway, and hardly anyone knows that he died in the first place. So that's a really interesting dynamic, that in life no one noticed him or showed him any kind of concern, no one reached out to him or saw him for who he really was. And now, as a spirit, that distance, that invisibility has become an even more literal experience. So thinking about that in relation to how Julian and Yadriel are each other's lifelines at this point makes me emo as heck. I am extremely deep in this relationship. I am so stressed because I honestly have no idea how it's going to work out. I've run the numbers 1,000 times and I just don't know. But for the sake of my children, I really hope it does. I have like 50 pages left, and a lot has to happen within those 50 pages. This is a very crucial time in my life. Last night's reading nearly did me in. Sometimes it's just a simple 5 words that can change the world, and my world was changed. After reading a certain part, I was out the game for like 10 minutes straight, and I've spent my entire workday on the brink of full-on gay panic. Trust me, I want to say something productive and thoughtful, but I am so deep in my feels right now, I'm not even kidding. Aiden has this way of describing Julian like a force of nature, and that completely takes me out and destroys me every single time it comes up on the page. Okay, I am gonna breathe and take a step back here because I do want to talk about how this story brilliantly addresses the emotional work and emotional education that trans people often have to take on themselves. If someone misgenders you, you're expected to console them or absolve them of their guilt and say it's totally okay when it's not. And especially if you're transitioning, you're expected to teach people what's appropriate and what isn't. The fact of the matter is that's an emotional burden that trans folks have to take on if they want to be treated with basic decency and respect. That's why it's so refreshing to see this easy, accepting relationship between Julian and Yadriel, and seeing Yadriel finally being around someone who just gets it. It's very easy for them to be emotionally vulnerable with each other, and it's really special to see that those kinds of relationships are possible and do in fact exist. In this final act, we're sort of turning the lens back to the mystery of Julian's death and why his summoning ritual hasn't gone according to plan up until this point, and I honestly have no idea what to expect. I think the story has done a great job of not giving anything away on that front, and I look forward to being surprised, shocked, and dismayed, or all of the above. So I am stressed, I am pressed, I am blessed by the gift that is this book, and that is the truth I am living in this moment. Okay, I've put it off long enough. It's time to tell you my final thoughts and sort of wrap up my reading experience with Cemetery Boys, which is asking a lot of me, to be honest. I am shook. I guess we should just start there. As predicted, I was shocked and dismayed in equal measures. The final reveals definitely left me reeling, and at first I was very resistant to it, but then looking back, you can definitely see the skillfully placed breadcrumbs leading up to those moments and creating some kind of sense. There definitely was that final puzzle piece locking into place kind of moment, and it was just a wild ride from like page 300 till the end. There was a lot of deep breathing exercises and inhuman noises that came along with reading this book, and I am thoroughly wrecked, obliterated, done. If I had to say one thing, I would say it wraps up pretty quickly, but that could totally just be because I was tearing through it and terrified the entire way, and I would not have put up a fight if Aiden had included like 20, 30, 200 more pages if they wanted. I just did not want to let these characters go, and I think that's the point I'm trying to make, because I do think it ended on exactly the right moment and exactly the right note. In my really short Goodreads review, I wrote, "I am convinced this book was written for me and me alone, and I will be accepting no other feedback at this time," and I would say that's pretty accurate. I'm not saying Yadriel and I are the same person, but I'm also not saying that we're not. And obviously there are some discrepancies there because Julian is Colombian, I believe, and Yadriel is Cubano, and I'm Mexican. It's not a one-to-one thing. But I also don't think you have to relate completely to someone's experience for it to be your lived experience, and that we can so deeply and meaningfully see ourselves in the smallest of details. And if walking into a kitchen and hearing an old lady jam out to Tejano music and singing Como la Flor doesn't represent me, I don't know what does. Speaking of the exact representation and content warnings, all of that will be listed down below and in a pinned comment as well, so definitely check that out if you're interested in reading this book. So zooming back out here to look at the bigger picture, for me, this was just one of the most heartwarming, comforting, joyous reading experiences. As you heard me talking about in days past, it definitely addresses queer pain and queer trauma head on because those are very real experiences, but I feel like this story is resolutely written from a place of love and joy. I felt incredibly seen. I felt like my struggles as a Latinx trans-spec person were definitely centered and validated, which is really important. But what I'm going to remember most looking back on this book is how much fun it was to read. It's hilarious. The dynamic between characters is electric. There's a high ratio of dad jokes. There's insane dumb boy energy. There's a romance I would lay down my life for. And ultimately, I think this story is just such a bright light. The atmosphere and sense of place is so energizing. As a lifelong resident of SoCal and someone who knows LA pretty well, all the California vibes and intel totally check out 100% A+. And the way the magic surrounding Dia de Muertos is described is so beautiful and immersive. I felt like I could picture everything perfectly, and it was just really well done. A lot of the Spanish was also not directly translated, which I love because while non-Spanish speakers can definitely pick up on what's being said contextually, it still feels like it's just a little something just for us. I don't know, I just felt so held by this story, if that makes any sense. Picking up this book every day felt like coming home. It felt like walking right into the familiar embrace of someone I've always known and always will know, and honestly, it just left me with a tremendous feeling of gratitude and happiness. This story has a lot to say about love, about acceptance and self-acceptance, and how those are two very different things, and how we have to do better by future generations when it comes to listening and empowering them to be exactly themselves. It's also about the very fine line between being hurt and being destructive, and how it's much more powerful to channel our energy into an additive mindset rather than a subtractive mindset. I just feel like I got so much from this book and I had such a good time with it. That experience honestly can't compare with anything else. I want to talk about it forever, I want to read it forever, and I just can't really verbalize how valuable it actually is. So that is a wrap on Cemetery Boys. If you stayed till the end, leave me a little skull emoji down below and tell me about some of your most anticipated queer releases of 2020, because Aiden Thomas really said queer, trans, Latinx rights, and that's the only kind of life I want to live. So thank you so much for watching. Catch you never, because I'm about to ascend to another plane of existence. I really hope you enjoyed watching this, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.